This is the United States History 201, Presentation 20, U.S. Intellectual Life. So we're going to look at a wide variety of U.S. intellectual life in this period and talk about its impact on American culture. And this is a long presentation, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. Now, when I talk about intellectual life, the things we're looking at are art, invention, literature, religion. We'll look at reform movements. We already talked about pro-slavery in Presentation 19. And some of the art we're going to talk about and some of the literature we're going to talk about are part of what's called the Romantic period. It was often said the United States was in the world but not part of the world in this period of time. What's a misnomer? Some of the Romantic literature and art that's being produced here in the United States rivaled the quality that was produced in Europe. And Romanticism is a way of looking at the past, historic themes, exotic places, exotic peoples, and American Romantic literature and art has that. Now, early 19th century American art, though, really focused on four important people. Gilbert Stuart, he was a Rhode Island-born artist, had about 1,000 paintings to his credit, and some of these are the most famous in American history, and painted some of the most famous people in American history. Thomas Sully, who was an English-born American artist, studied under Stuart, and the reason I put Columbus Museum here is because one of his paintings is at the Columbus Museum in Georgia. John Trumbull, who was a Connecticut-born American artist. His work focused on significant people and events during the American War for Independence in the early Federal period. And then finally, John James Audubon, who was a French-born American naturalist and painter, who spent many years in the South as a teacher, an art teacher, essentially. And his Birds of America is the one of the most famous works of art, collections of art in the world in the 19th century, and it really impacted the way that people viewed nature in the United States and the portrayal of nature in art. This is Stuart's George Washington. It's often called the Athenaeum. It was painted in 1796, and of course this is the image that was used for the $1 bill. But Stuart painted this several different times and refined it every time. But this is what the original looked like. This is his George Washington called the Lansdowne Portrait of 1797. One of the more famous portraits of George Washington, right about the time he was leaving the executive branch to go back to Mount Vernon. This is what he looked like at the end of his second term as president. And this is his painting of Thomas Jefferson from 1821. Again, after Jefferson had retired. This is Thomas Sully's Passage of the Delaware, George Washington, 1819. So his version of what Washington might have looked like crossing the Delaware River during leading to the Battle of Trenton. This is his portrait of Andrew Jackson from 1824. And his portrait of Thomas Jefferson from 1821-22. This is Trumbull's Washington resigning his commission. Painted this in 1817, so this is what Trumbull believed it looked like when Washington resigned his commission to the Continental Congress. His Declaration of Independence, very famous painting. And finally, his portrait of Alexander Hamilton from 1806. And finally, we have a few images from Audubon's Birds of America. This is his image of the Baltimore Oriole, the Blue Jay, and the Carolina Pigeon. So all these are important works of art in this early Federal period leading into the Romantic period. So American Romance artists tended to be focused on an area called the Hudson River School. They had large picturesque landscapes, historic themes, and exotic places, usually violent or beautiful, but always spectacular. And there were four important American Romance artists: Thomas Cole, Thomas Moran, Albert Bierstadt, and Frederick Edwin Church. So I'm going to show you, we'll talk about these people in detail. Thomas Cole is considered to be the founder of the Hudson River School. He was actually born in England and settled in New York. Very much influenced by theology and history, and he's famous for sequence paintings. So I have a few of these I'm going to show you. So first and foremost, this is why it's romantic. Daniel Boone sitting at the door of his cabin. Again, a historic figure, exotic place, the frontier, exotic scenes of nature. So this is why it's often considered romance. This is one of his sequence paintings. This is the past. So you have the castle in England there with the jousting tournament. And then you have the present, which is the castle is now ruined, and now you have simple Shepherd, where you used to have this jousting tournament. This is the theology. So this is the Voyage of Life Childhood. So this is a sequence painting as well. So you see this represents, of course, birth. Then the Voyage of Life Youth. Now the young man is off on his own. It's the springtime of his life. See trials and tribulations and, of course, heaven in the future, but not in his immediate future. The Voyage of Life Manhood. Now he's facing these trials and tribulations through the mountains, dark clouds, violent waters. And then finally the Voyage of Life Old Age, where the only light is in front, and the spirit ascending to heaven. Thomas Moran is perhaps the most famous of the Hudson River School. Painted awe-inspiring work of the American West, principally Wyoming, but other places as well, Arizona. But some of his paintings are the most famous in American history, like the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, which actually hangs in the Capitol. And this is Yellowstone National Park. Chasm of the Colorado. And again, the paintings are very large. They are, in some cases, can take up a wall. And the Teton Range, and then finally the Grand Canyon in Arizona. Albert Bierstadt was born in Germany but settled in Massachusetts. Again, another of the Hudson River School artists. Had a competition with Moran over who could get the federal government to buy their paintings. And he primarily focused on California, whereas Moran was in Wyoming. He didn't get out to California. Bierstadt was focusing on California, principally Yosemite Valley. So here's Yosemite National Park, looking down Yosemite Valley, painted this in 1865, among the Sierra Nevada and gates of the Yosemite. And then we have Frederick Edwin Church. His landscapes always included a bit of spiritualism, and he rejected the Enlightenment. So he is part of the Hudson River School, and here's his Niagara Falls. His Twilight in the Wilderness, and his Aurora Borealis. Now, invention. A couple of important inventors to talk about in this period of time. First and foremost will be Eli Whitney. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which allowed for easier removal of cotton seeds from harvested plants. We talked about this in presentation 19, how this led to the cotton revolution in the South. He also later developed interchangeable parts for firearms. So Whitney's an important guy. Without the cotton gin, the cotton doesn't take off like it does in the South. And of course, maybe the entire Southern economy changes. But this creates a climate where you can grow short staple cotton, you can get the seeds out of it, and of course you can make a lot of money. Robert Fulton invented the steamboat, the North River Steamboat in 1807, which made river transportation easier. And of course now you can go upriver, which was important. Now in terms of literature, a lot of famous authors in this period. James Fenimore Cooper, an American author and political commentator. His novels, of course, are in the romantic genre. The frontier, historic themes, exotic peoples and places, rugged individualism. He was the author of what were called the Leatherstocking Tales, including The Last of the Mohicans in 1826. And of course, this is why it's exotic, why it's romantic, historic places, historic themes. In fact, the main character in these Leatherstocking Tales was Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone was the quintessential American for much of the early federal period. Everyone thought that Daniel Boone personified what it meant to be an American in this period of time. Washington Irving was also from New York, historian, diplomat, author. His most famous work being The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and also Rip Van Winkle. Washington Irving was highly critical of New Englanders, Yankees. This was in contrast to Northerners. He's from the North, but he really didn't care for New Englanders. Nobody did in New York. This was something quite different from. They were quite different from New Yorkers, and they were money grubbing. Social ladder. They tried to climb the social ladder in deceivious ways, This didn't appeal to Irving. In fact, that's what The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is about. You have this Ichabod Crane, who's a Yankee, who's trying to climb the social ladder of New York by marrying the daughter of a wealthy man, and he's not very well liked. Nobody likes Ichabod Crane, and so eventually the native New Yorkers run him out of town. Herman Melville, also from New York, wrote the book Moby Dick, which is about a troubled soul and self-destructive force, which he was critical of abolitionists. That's what he's talking about in the book. And he opposed the Civil War because he didn't think that the war was just, and he was highly critical of rich Northerners who paid to get out of the war while the commoners went and fought But his family, all of his family were Democrats, who were very much against the war and very much against the Lincoln administration. Nathaniel Hawthorne from Massachusetts wrote The Scarlet Letter in the House of Seven Gables, which explained the price individuals pay for cutting themselves off from society. He also opposed the war. He wasn't for the war, thought that the North was violating the Constitution and wasn't in favor of the Lincoln administration. But he is highly critical of Massachusetts society and Puritan society, in essence. Now, one of the intellectual trends in this period was something called Transcendentalism, and it's going to impact authors. The Transcendentalists believe that a person's goal should be liberation from the confines of understanding and the cultivation of reason. So how do you do that? Well, each individual should strive to transcend the limits of the intellect and allow their emotions or their soul to create an original relation to the universe. The America they loved was an ideal America. This is where you get idealism. It wasn't the America in which they lived. It's America that was in their head, and therefore they wanted legislation and society to fit that ideal. And so you start doing that. You start trying to focus legislation to change things. This is where you get reform. Henry David Thoreau from Massachusetts wrote two very important works in this time period that were transcendentalist in nature, Civil Disobedience and Walden. He believed in the removal of society, so he would go live on Walden Pond to try to find himself, quote unquote. And negative action in his mind was non-action. So you disobeyed, but you didn't try to work necessarily through the legislature to do things. It wasn't a negative vote on reform legislation. It was just you pull yourself out of society and you place a negative that way. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a Unitarian minister, and we'll talk about Unitarianism, but this was a new religious sect of this period of time. And he believed humans should work to become one with nature. So again, nature, Transcendentalism is very influential in the modern environmentalist movement, but you get out in nature and you find yourself in nature. And then there was Walt Whitman, who was influenced by Transcendentalism, often called the spokesman for democracy, supported the Union during the Civil War, whereas in contrast to people like Melville and Hawthorne, who were against it, he was for it. His most famous work is Leaves of Grass. It's a collection of poetry, which was a celebration of sexuality and democracy. And so this stuff was considered to be too erotic in the 19th century. Now, the most famous work out of this, well, one of them, is "Oh Captain, My Captain," which is a poem about Abraham Lincoln. He wrote a couple about Abraham Lincoln, but this one gained quite a bit of influence in the 1980s with the film Dead Poets Society. Now, Southern literature was also popular at this time. You don't hear much about it, but there were many important Southern literary figures. People like William Gilmore Simms of South Carolina. Sims's Francis Marion and the Sword and the Distaff were two very important books. So he was, again, romantic. He wrote about historic themes. Francis Marion, the war. Christmas in Charleston, for example, so an important guy. But he was blacklisted in the 1850s because his books were called the anti-Uncle Tom's Cabin books, and they often portrayed Southern life as he and other Southerners said it was, not the way that abolitionists were portraying it. Augustus B. Longstreet wrote a book entitled Georgia Scenes in the 1830s, which is about frontier life in Georgia, and it's very funny. It's comedy more than anything else, and it's an interesting read if your family has been in this area for a long period of time. Henry Timrod is often called the poet laureate of the Confederacy. Wrote the South Carolina State Song from South Carolina, and again, very filled with romantic imagery. And then finally, you have Edgar Allan Poe, whose works are often correctly labeled romantic literature. But it portrays the darkness of the human spirit. For example, The Raven, Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is the first American detective story. Now, out of this Transcendentalist movement, you're going to get people called Utopians. And so utopia, by definition, is a word that means nowhere. And these are places that didn't exist. Well, because the first book, entitled Utopia, written by Sir Thomas More, is essentially playing on that term. Well, but there are going to be utopians in this period of time, people that think that they could have perfect societies. So people like George Ripley, whose perfect society called Brook Farm in Massachusetts implemented elements of Fourierism, socialism, and feminism. But the idea of Brook Farm was that people should have as much leisure as possible and share the work to have leisure. But the problem with these type of socialist experiments is that most partook in leisure and not work. So eventually on a farm, the experiment's going to fail and the group would burn down what they called the Hive, the main building there. John H. Noyes of New York formed something called the Oneida Community in 1841. The Oneida community was based on something called perfectionism, and it had two components: mutual criticism and complex marriage. All the adults at the Oneida community would be criticized by the elders of the community so you could perfect yourself. And the idea was to create morally perfect adults to have morally perfect children, an improved race of children. But this also involved something called complex marriage. Every man was married to every woman at the community. And so the activities were highly regulated and supervised, so they could ensure that only the morally perfect people were having children. And Oneida was actually successful because it turned to business and manufacturing. In fact, Noyes ran the community for about 30 years until he was booted out of the area because people were disgusted with the immorality, in terms of the Christian sense, of Oneida community. And in 1881, the Oneida Company became a joint stock company making silverware, and it still exists today. And there are some of the people there at the Oneida community. Now, religion was also undergoing reform at this time. There were several new denominations formed. The Unitarian Church, which is Christian in name only, essentially Unitarians. They used to call these people Arian Christians, but they believe in Jesus, but he's not the Son of God, and it's not the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's all, there's just God. So basically, these are essentially Jewish people who believe in Christ. Is kind of the way to look at it. The Church of Christ, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Primitive Baptists, Free Will Baptists, Free Methodists. All these new denominations are popping up because of the Second Great Awakening. So you have revivals. People are interested in reform and democratizing the church. So you start to see all these new denominations pop up in this period of time. One of these new Christian denominations would be Mormonism. So Joseph Smith in 1830, founds the Mormon Church, and he helped write the Book of Mormon. In fact, the story is that he received a vision from the archangel Gabriel, and that Gabriel told him where to find a set of tablets. When he discovered the tablets, they were in a language only he could read. This was verified by other elders of the church, and then they disappeared. But he memorized these tablets, and then this became the Book of Mormon, which is 500 double-column pages. So it's quite an extensive book, and the fact that Smith could barely read and write, it's an interesting development. He established his group in Ohio, then moved to Illinois, where they started practicing polygamy, and because of some of the confines of the group, he would be murdered by his own people in 1844. At that point, Brigham Young will lead the Mormons west to Utah, where they will settle, and beginning in 1857, there's actually a war between the Mormons and the United States called the Utah War. And the Mormons wanted to secede from the United States because they were not being allowed to practice freely and worship freely. Utah become an American territory. Well, eventually the Mormons officially give up polygamy and form something called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the LDS Church, which is still around today. And then there's reform. So reform movements are going to focus on two things: abolition and feminism in this period of time. Most centered in the burnt-over district in New York and Massachusetts. It was called the burnt-over because of revivals. And most Americans, though, it must be said, rejected reform and considered reformers too radical and with socialist inclinations. So most Americans were not necessarily acceptive of reform movements. In fact, abolitionists and feminists were on the fringe of society, and there was no way they're going to have an impact ultimately, in American politics. Eventually, abolitionists would through the war, but until that point, they didn't have a large stake in American policy. In fact, the first abolition societies were in the South, 100 of the first 140. Most early abolitionist newspapers were in the South. Most efforts to end slavery originated in the South, including manumission and colonization. The Declaration of Independence, originally Jefferson's first draft, contained a provision or clause which would have criticized the institution of slavery. There were restrictions on the slave trade, which were insisted by the South. And the American Colonization Society, founded in 1817, the idea was to take freed slaves and bring them back to Africa. This was seen as a humane thing to do at the time, and Southerners generally supported this. So colonization was supported by people like James Monroe, Henry Clay, even Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln pursued a colonization plan even during the war. And in fact, there was a country of Liberia founded in this period of time on the west coast of Africa. This was founded by former American slaves. The interesting thing about this is that slavery would continue in Liberia until the 1940s. So even though these people are leaving slavery, going back to Africa, they're going to enslave the native Africans who are there in Liberia. And it must be said that colonization really found no support in the federal government financially, which is why it kind of went away. Now, you had something called the Underground Railroad between the 1830s and the 1860s. This was a series of safe houses and places for slaves to go that they could escape to the north. And you had people that would help guide them to these areas, most famously being Harriet Tubman, who's often called Moses. And here's a map of the Underground Railroad, some of the safe houses. The object, of course, was to get to Canada. If you got to the United States, you could be recaptured and sent south. So you wanted to get to Canada. Now, William Lloyd Garrison was a very famous abolitionist, had something called the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he published a newspaper entitled Liberator, which was, again, rabidly abolitionist. In fact, when this paper showed up in the South, there were fines in the South for distributing the paper. So Southerners were very much against this newspaper and Garrison's abolitionist, what they considered to be agitation. You had Henry Ward Beecher from Connecticut, who supported all reform movements. In fact, when we get to the Kansas issue, he sent weapons out west to Kansas. These were called Beecher's Bibles. So again, very much interested in the abolition movement. Frederick Douglass, who was a Maryland slave, became an abolitionist after his escape in the 1840s. Wrote a very important book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. And he heavily influenced the Lincoln administration, particularly after the war. That must be noted with Frederick Douglass. And then there's Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose Uncle Tom's Cabin was one of the better-selling works of the 19th century. And this is how Northerners perceived the South. And this is why people like Sims were writing the anti-Uncle Tom's Cabin books, because they realized the kind of impact this book was having on on Northerners in the way they viewed the South. Now, women's rights, two most important figures were Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who lived from 1815 to 1902. She was in charge of something called the Seneca Falls Convention, where they get the Declaration of Sentiments. So, essentially, they're going to assert, through this Declaration of Sentiments, the things that they want. But they wanted women's suffrage. They wanted the ability to vote. And eventually the feminist movement will turn into what it is today. But Stanton was against abortion, for example. She believed in marriage. She believed in family. Very much behind that. She just wanted women to be able to vote more than anything else. And at one point she was trying to get alcohol banned as well. And then there's Susan B. Anthony, a Maryland abolitionist and feminist, again interested in women's suffrage. She was really Stanton's political partner for most of their lives. And Anthony never married, and she was very critical of marriage, in fact. Whereas Stanton has children, and Anthony never does. So there is a little difference there. Okay, well that's it for presentation 20. I'll see you next time for presentation 21.